Are we all here? Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Lee, and I'm the moderator for this panel. And we're going to have actually a series of 3 presentations and then open it up to Q&A. So the focus of this panel is going to discuss the importance of meme culture within the news and journalism cycle. And not only are we going to do this panel, but we're also going to do a series of 2 workshops, one after this panel, one tomorrow, and also have people come to dinner. So I'll make an announcement about that afterwards. But first and foremost, I'm going to introduce Fizz, who's up first. And Farida is the director of the Visual Social Media Lab, which brings together a group of interdisciplinary researchers from academia and industry interested in analyzing social media images. And she's also the professor of digital media at the Manchester School of Art. Off to you. There.
All right, is this on? Yeah.
And a new mom.
Okay.
And a new mom.
All right, thanks very much for being here. So this is a continuation of a panel that we did last year, where one of the things that we were really interested in is how can journalists better understand memes and what are the resources potentially that are needed, kind of training needs and so on. So what I'm contributing to this panel today is a project that in some ways arose from that panel last year, where we specifically looked at the role that visuals played in the UK and French elections last year. And this is a collaboration with First Draft, with Claire Wardle, and the Visual Social Media Lab. And most of this research was carried out by Hannah Guy, one of my PhD students, who unfortunately couldn't be here, but she's very much present, as is Claire in the slides. So one of the reasons that we were really interested in doing this, and this is the work that we do in the lab, is to better understand the role of images in society. And given the kind of discussions around mis and disinformation, one of the things that we felt was happening a lot is that images were somehow overlooked. So they're both really present. Everybody understands that misinformation can spread much more rapidly through images, both photographs, memes, videos, and so on. But how that happens, or why that happens, or which types spread faster, and so on, isn't really well understood, or there is an emphasis on particular types of images. And what we wanted to do is, what if you take these 2 big European elections, what actually are the images? And what are the issues in terms of people's lack of understanding? So how do you understand context when it comes to this potentially really dangerous vehicle for mis and disinformation? So what we ended up doing is we partnered with First Draft, and they were involved in, or they were running 2 projects in French elections and the UK elections, with Crosscheck and Full Fact in the UK. And basically what they would do is they, for the UK elections, they produce daily newsletters with the kind of most prominent mis and disinformation stories that day, and they had a number of metrics that they were using to kind of figure out what were the most shared stories, and particularly, basically, all of them contained images or were image focused. If you hear a baby crying, that's my 8-month-old daughter in the back. She was in my belly last year at the panel. For the Crosscheck project, there was a website which basically did the same. So you could go on this website and find out if these stories were true or false. So you've got 2 examples here. So in total, we looked at 95 of these image-led stories, 43 from France and 52 from the UK. And then what we wanted to understand is, at a much more nuanced level, what are the types of images that are being shared? So this is, we're academics, and so we were very, very granular and kind of nitpicky in terms of different types of images. So we had 21 different types. In terms of operationalizing this, I would say don't go for 21 different types, because it's really, really difficult to code for. But I can talk you through some of them. Then we looked at the level of accuracy, so what is actually going on in terms of mis or disinformation. We looked at the topic, the motivation. This is one of the things that we're very interested in. Can you figure out something about the motivation? Who posted it? Where was it posted? And what was the source? So for all of these 95 images, we try to answer all of these questions. Now, I have no time to go through all of this, but our report is coming out in a few weeks, and please approach me afterwards if you want more info. So most of you will have seen this typology that Claire produced. I think out of frustration to try and be much, much more nuanced about this debate. And many of you will remember that last year, none of us were allowed to use the term so I'm not going to. So in terms of mis and disinformation, this was an original stab at kind of trying to build in this nuance, and this is also then something that we expanded on, but specifically for images. Now, of course, there is a good chance that the images that you're looking at are accurate, right? So the first category was they're not false, they're not fake, they're accurate. Or they're accurate, but they're humorous. So the information isn't problematic in any way, it's not false, it's just given a particular slant. Now then we ended up with 10 categories where the information was indeed inaccurate. So potentially humorous, so this is Theresa May going live, and lots of angry faces immediately popping up. So this is obviously kind of a parody. It can also be misleading content, so that the use of the information is to frame something in a particular way. So some of it might be true, some of the visuals might be real, but it's framed in a way that is very much in terms of kind of agenda setting, so giving a very, very particular slant to it, but not necessarily humorous. Then there's imposter content, where the information is there's a pretense that it's genuine. So in this case, Marine Le Pen is seen potentially as the source of this information, but it's someone impersonating her. Manipulated content, where in this case this is an example of Damien Green in the UK, where parts were taken from an interview that he did, but then what is actually highlighted is manipulated in order to, in this case, to kind of give the impression that he's keen to damage workers' rights. So bits of it come from a genuine interview, and then it's taken out of context with particular emphasis. So it's manipulated. Then there's straight up fabrication. So this was in the aftermath of the Manchester bombings, where Ariana Grande was purported to who would pay for the funerals of the victims. This was completely false, but this is presented as coming from some of her Twitter news accounts. So this is 100% false. Then, and this happens a lot with infographics, false connections, where the headlines, the visuals, and the captions don't support the content. So what you end up with is this really complex layer of trying to figure out which bits are truthful, which bits are manipulated potentially, or how are they connected in terms of what they're trying to present. And we see this a lot with the visualizations. False context, this was the largest category. This potentially comes as no surprise to the people in this room, where the image, and this is really, really important, the image is truthful. The image is not altered. The image is technically real. But it's the context that is false. So in this case, this is an old image of someone walking around with what was suggested to be an ISIS flag in the French streets. And this was, of course, during the elections presented as this is what potentially could happen to France. So this is a really massive category. No context provided is another one. What you have here is often information that is really, really difficult to verify. So this is information, for example, what you can get is really old tweets dredged up. A politician may have said something problematic a really long time ago. Did he really say it? Did she really say it? And so on. Hard to verify stuff. So no context is provided, but it's potentially still very spreadable. Exaggerations, where specifically with statistics, information is grossly exaggerated or underreported. And again, because we're looking at elections, this will be to really kind of discredit political opponents and so on. So this is an example from the UK. And then finally, the final category. So you can see that we added 3 categories to the original typology, is a genuine mistake. So this is from the French elections, where again you get a lot of images saying, how are the different candidates doing? But in this case, this adds up to 107%. right? So someone somewhere hasn't, you know, done the sums properly, and clearly, you know, this is wrong. So we have called this genuine mistake. Perhaps it's not, but this is what we've coded for. We've only found one example. Now, just to give you just a couple of minutes on some of the findings. So this is both the French, the UK, and the total of this. This is in terms of image type. And what we see is that the first 5 categories is the bulk of the data, basically. So most of the types of visuals that are used are videos, photographs, data visualizations, photographs with text, and then screenshots of tweets. And then, as I said, we've got 21 different types, and I haven't shown you all of these, but we really went into the kind of nitty-gritty, what different types of images do we find. And one of the things to pull out here is that image macros, so in terms of memes, and a lot of discussion is always around memes, and what is really important is that the kind of classic image macro, if you like, which is of course, you know, not what memes are. It's a much broader type of image. But if you think about that kind of classic image macro, this was only 3% in total of the data that we looked at. So this is in terms of the kinds of images. There is a much wider variety, but also in terms of what are really the dominant images, it is really photographs and video. Now, in terms of the level of accuracy, so what happened to this typology? What were people spreading? It's false context. So this is the biggest finding for us. And in terms of, you know, how can we take this forward, both for journalists, but also potentially for the platforms? This is the stuff that is so incredibly hard to deal with algorithmically. So in terms of verification programs and so on, you are not dealing with images that are false. You're not dealing with images that are technically traceable as false. So you kind of can't image cache them and say, you know, these are all the ones that we find, and every instance of that image is therefore automatically false. It doesn't work like that, because the image isn't the problem, it's the context. So if you think that 30% of our data set, and even though it was a small data set, but 30% of that presented the false context, the image in a way is not the issue. And I think this is what is the really difficult thing to deal with if you want to start thinking about how can this be taken further, how can platforms deal with it, how can journalists deal with it? Because what you potentially have is new occurrences every single time. Sometimes the context might be correct and the image is correct, sometimes the image is correct and the context is false. So this report is out in a few weeks. We are planning more research, specifically also in the aftermath of the report that Claire and Hossein put out for the Council of Europe, and I can speak more to that in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Fizz. Next up is Anne Chaomina, who's actually the author of an upcoming book on memes called Memes to Movements, How the World's Most Viral Media is Changing Social Protests and Power, and it'll be out in January of 2019. But Anne is also a technologist and an artist. She leads the product team at Medan, where they're building Check, a platform for collaboratively verifying news in real time, and Bridge, a platform for translating social media and message app content. She also is the project lead at the Credibility Coalition, which is an effort to develop a standard for assessing content credibility online.
Thank you, Jenny. So I wanted to talk a little bit, kind of continue this conversation around context and around imagery, and look at some kind of the broader media context in which we look at a lot of images online. And this is based on a talk I actually gave at Sheffield with Freitas Lab, and then also some of the writings I've been doing in my book. And so I'm talking here about politics and fandoms because part of my concern, as we're working on misinformation, is that in addition to thinking about information, we should also be thinking about issues around emotions, narrative, and identity, and that the language of fandoms might help us there in terms of figuring out potential approaches. A few months ago, there's this kind of energy in the United States about Oprah 2020. Oprah given a very, very powerful speech at the Golden Globes, and people were really thrilled about this idea. And there's a number of memes about this. And And I think what really clicked for me was this notion that that Oprah was much more than a meme, obviously, and that she's a brand. She's a very, very transmedia brand. She has a magazine, she has a book, she's in movies, she has events, she has food, she has fashion. There are many gifts that people make about her. And so Oprah, in many ways, looks a lot like Trump as the brand in terms of someone who is omnipresent, who crosses all types of media and experiences. And it got me thinking of that maybe contemporary fandom, fandom, which is the idea that people who like a brand engage with that brand and that the brand engages back, is a more useful framework for looking at some contemporary politicians' media strategies and also how people respond to them. So in other words, we need to start taking Kim Kardashian, Grumpy Cat, The Walking Dead more seriously to understand why are these types of media really popular, and how are politicians, how are people engaging in politics, leveraging these techniques, and what can we learn from that? So Henry Jenkins has a nice definition, and I'll just read the top one, but basically, fandom refers to social structures and cultural practices created by the most passionately engaged consumers of mass media properties. I think we can all think of what like fandoms that when we think about this, like Doctor Who, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about Walking Dead because that's my fandom and that I enjoy. And I was talking with Penny Andrews when I was at Sheffield, and Penny has this great notion here that we see both fandom and anti-fandom of politicians past and present. It's a lot easier to send a tweet than to write a formal letter. And I think this notion of fandom and anti-fandom is important. This notion that you love a brand, and you also love to hate it, right? And that's actually a key component of how power works in terms of media. So when we're thinking about how Trump's communication style, and I'll just focus on here because of the American context, but I think a number of politicians around the world are using these strategies. We need to think about this in context of presidents, from Lincoln with the telegraph, FDR with radio, Reagan, who's a literal film star, and then the American Revolution with pamphlets. Presidents and people in power have to adapt to our new media environments and develop new strategies that are adaptive to how those media work. And Trump, as a reality star, as a former tabloid star, is adaptive in that way. So I want to show, here's Walking Dead, and here's Trump as a reality star. Some of the parallels I see in terms of branding. And, we could do this for Oprah as well, but just in terms of how Trump is much more than the Twitter president, but is actually someone who's omnipresent across a variety of media. So Walking Dead, how many of you guys watch Walking Dead? Anyone? Yeah? Okay, I see a few hands. Okay. As you know, it's much more than a TV show. It's the most popular TV show on cable television in the United States, but they have a broad social media presence, they have video games, they have a meme culture, they have toys, they have Walking Dead experiences, and then they have a Talking Dead talk show that shows after Walking Dead to encourage people to talk about the show. So if this sounds familiar, this idea of getting people to talk about you is how you center your show. One of the things that you see with Trump's communication style is this notion of narrative tension, of trailers. Walking Dead does this. They have a trailer for the trailer. They're always like leading up to the next thing. And you see this here with Trump saying, there's a calm before the storm. You'll be extremely impressed by this person. This notion of leading up, of getting people to talk about you before the thing actually happens is really key here. Trump is the first president that I believe where you can actually play him in a video game. Just like in Walking Dead, you can play the characters in The Walking Dead. And when we think about cosplay, are people familiar with cosplay, the idea of dressing up as your favorite characters? So it's very, very common with Walking Dead fandoms. And during the Charlottesville rally, I think we saw people who dressed up in that same way. And so this notion of fandom, this notion of engagement across different media, I think is really key to understand here. And to understand that attention and narrative operate differently in the 21st century. Media is mimetic, it is remixed, transformed, it's transmedia, it's digital broadcast events, experiences, products. It's not just about the digital experience, it's about this entire transmedia experience that both Oprah and Trump, I think, are really like masters of. And so when we look at something like Covfefe, that tweet, right? We all remember this, yeah? The memes that came out of that were also interesting. And the fact, though, that Trump embraced the typo, who can figure out the true meaning and joy, is part of this fandom, part of that anti-fandom. And when you think about, this is data from Google News Lab visualized by Axios about the most searched terms. During 2017, you see all these different spikes. One of the interesting things here was when you look here, look at beautiful chocolate cake, look at Covfefe. and see how they get, you get these spikes alongside, very serious policy issues like the transgender military ban, Sean Spicer, and indeed the most searched for topics of 2017 were the Women's March, number 2, and the number 3 was Covfefe. So the largest protest in United States history got about as much search attention as a typo from the president. And so in terms of the ability to embrace meme culture and embrace people's tendencies to want to talk about you, it's a really powerful way to drive attention. And indeed, with social media dynamics, to drive headlines, you pull attention rather than pushing agendas. This is kind of the new adaptive strategy that we're seeing with a number of other political leaders. And so when Trump is retweeting memes, whether that's a Pepe meme or the CNN GIF, we should start asking what role do journalists play in amplifying these agendas, these messages? What happens when these memes become part of literally front page news? To what extent, how are journalists framing these stories? How might they be inadvertently amplifying certain stories? And what is the intentionality that journalists bring here, in addition to just the images themselves? And so I think we should ask that as a community. And in a world of pull dynamics, controversy is often the best way to set an agenda. Again, who is the brand you love and the brand you love to hate? It's controversy is the way to get everyone to talk about you. So when we think about the NFL protests, take a knee, hashtag take a knee, it's this, this notion that there were two sides of this camp. It reminded me a lot of the blue-gold dress, that visible disagreement, whether it's a blue dress or is it a gold dress, the fact that you visibly disagree with each other is a way to fuel attention and agenda setting, that this became one of the most viral images of its time, for like the exact year. But that dynamic is, I think it's important to understand. And when we're looking at some of the propaganda strategies that have come out around from Russian propagandists, is that notion of creating tension is one way to set agenda. Similarly, during the take a knee, there was less attention to Puerto Rico at the time, and as soon as Trump started paying attention to that, just talking about that, creating tension around that, that's when you started to see spikes in attention. And so, thinking about how politicians and others use these techniques to drive media agendas, I think is an important part of this conversation. So I think focusing on dis, and accurate information is an extremely necessary step. It's absolutely critical. And in addition, we need to understand emotion, identity, and performance in our online ecosystems to think about framing and narrative. And this really ties back to this Council of Europe report. And there's this one paragraph that I really appreciated, where Claire and Hossein noted that we need to fight rumors and conspiracy with engaging and powerful narratives that leverage the same techniques of disinformation, of provoking emotional response, repetition, strong visual aspect, powerful narrative. In other words, creating new narratives in the way that narratives are built in the 21st century, which is transmedia, it's emotive, it engages people. And so when we think about Covfefe, right, this is, it's one of many memes that people, even in the resistance to Trump, have used his language. And this is what mastery of attention and narrative looks like in the 21st century, where you have the fandom and the anti-fandom. And that's a way to set the agenda. And how do we try to drive new narratives? What is the way to take control as journalists, as storytellers, to understand the story? And so George Lakoff has a nice taxonomy of tweets here, and so much of this is focused on narrative. It's not just about attention; it's about the framing. It's about the story that one wants to tell. And so, how do we create new stories? And so, what we're starting to see in the United States with the emergence of the March for Our Lives is students using many of these same techniques to drive attention and narrative. And so you had a really powerful speech by Emma Gonzalez. You had misinformation campaigns. You had there's an image from her from Teen Vogue ripping up a Target image, and then on the other side is a misinformation meme that had her ripping up the Constitution. Right, it was a Photoshop remix, and it was part of a number of conspiracy theories that were floating around about this, about crisis actors, the deep state. But what was interesting was watching how the students used a transmedia approach, developed a fandom, developed a meme lab that was featured in Vanity Fair, used marches and experiences, used products, used this transmedia experience to drive a narrative and to make themselves extremely difficult to ignore. And so understanding this, I think, and how these things work, I think is key for us. And so I guess I just want to add a few questions here, in terms of moving forward, is thinking about how journalists work with emotions and identity signals in a productive way to build trust, that this notion of dispassionate journalism is something I think we need to question in this particular media environment. How can journalists work across media, transmedia, that engages audiences, right? It's not just about the article anymore. It's about so many different experiences and types of media. And also recognizing that we have now a new field of contention, which is this digital space. Different actors are iterating and innovating. It's to look at disinformation campaigns and also information campaigns and advocacy campaigns and understand them in a field of contention. And so how do we responsibly cover those and discuss those? So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Get the computer up. Next up is Connie Moonshot. Dr. Shahat is the News Frames Director at Global Voices, and her work historically has actually focused on the intersections of computing and democratic life. So among the things she's done is work on developing software for the International Space Station. Her dissertation was in German history, and most recently she's also worked at the Carter Center, Emory University, and the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University. And here we go.
Thank you, Jenny. And I just, user error, let's see. Yeah. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Yay. Good afternoon. So I'm here actually to share one particular case. We can consider it a case study. Let's see what happens here. But before I begin, maybe I should just explain a little bit about this initiative that I'm representing. It's called News Frames. I'm part of a group called Global Voices, which is an international network of bloggers, journalists, activists from around the world. I'm trying to think about what it means to do less dominant themes in media. How do you do that kind of reporting? And News Frames is an initiative to try and bring the data aspect to that, given all the new technologies that are available in machine learning and AI. What kinds of tools can be made available to journalists in collaboration with others to try and think about analysis? So just to put it in a nutshell, our platform as well as our initiative is about collaborative media analysis. And I think the best way to put it is that trying to bring together the expertise of data and data scientists with the expertise of local journalists. Because to be frank, for those of you who have maybe already worked with large data sets, it's very large and hard. It's not something that can be done automatically. And that's a little bit goes to my case today. So the first thing I want to do is to share a specific example of an image. So we are interested often in user-generated content, and that information comes often in the form of images and memes. So let's go ahead and think about this one particular case. In News Frames, we were interested in the problem, trying to think about false information that has been circulated around, and so we asked our volunteers from around the world to contribute examples to us to try and think about, can we collect a central database? And this is how we came across this one example. The full report of this is actually in this particular story. If you want to go ahead and look at those details, when a picture is worth 1,000 wrong words. But I'll go ahead and just give you some of the brief. And I would also like to say that there's just a trigger warning. The following images are graphic and contain violence, for those of you who may be uncomfortable. So this is an image that took place. This is a real image of an event that happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2010. And it involves a tanker accident in which over 230 people were killed. So again, happened originally in 2010 in the DRC. I can tell you a couple of things what it's not as well. It is not Nigeria in 2015. You can see, hopefully, that the same image is reflected now in a meme. This particular example of the meme was shared in the United States. Another example of what it's not Myanmar in 2016 either. This is coming from a Facebook feed shared in Arabic, paired with other real images from Myanmar. So just to kind of think about those two narratives. So we took this one image and we tried to figure out this question. Can we trace this how far can we take technologies to trace this and where could we find them? So with this particular image, we were able to confirm its location in either, I guess I'll put it, stories, false information stories, or actually fact-checking stories in at least 20 different countries around the world, and also traces in others. And so we just wanted to show that spread. So let me just make an observation about that. So it's not Nigeria in 2015, but also in these examples that we shared through this story, it was also not Nigeria in 2011 or 2012 or 2013. Other examples where this image resurfaced over and over again. And for those of you who are familiar with the rise of, say, for example, Facebook and Twitter, this is actually sometimes on forums. Sometimes you can see emails that were pasted to public forums. So we're not just talking about Facebook or Twitter. And again, with Myanmar as well, this was represented as an example of the Rohingya crisis in 2012, in 2014, and in 2015. So it's cyclical as it's happening around the world. These are examples of confirmed data that we have with metadata, screenshots, that we think that we can confirm these many countries have examples of this image. They happen on forums, they happen on social media platforms, they also happen on one particular journalistic publication with aspirations to journalism ethics. And if you think about the way that they perhaps first encountered that image, what kind of context did they have when they encountered the image from user-generated content? It certainly wasn't the original DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo picture. I also should mention that those were the confirmed cases, but there were also these many more that we couldn't feel absolutely sure of, but we also felt that there were enough traces for these countries as well. Just to kind of come back to that map. And the final thing I think is just a challenge. It's really hard to do this kind of work. This story, we could have waited longer, another month basically, to continue to verify additional countries, additional languages, basically, to sort of have language experts who could come and read these particular examples and tell us what they thought the pictures were saying and not saying. The specific tool that we used in this case was a reverse engine search, image search engine called TinEye. And one of the things that TinEye does really well, in addition to giving you a stable URL that you can kind of hang on to and share among a team of collaborators, is that it gives you sort of dates in terms of when a specific image was captured on a server, what that server URL looks like. And then from there, you can sort of start to build some sort of arguments about, where that country, what country is it located in, et cetera. And I can say that in a number of these cases, actually, we knew that some people had originally posted the image as real news and took it down, but they left the image on their server. So the image on the server was still available, even though the news story had been deleted. So in terms of just trying to do that work, in terms of our Newsframes project, we're trying to figure out what kinds of tools could actually help us do that work. Is it worthy to do that work, and how can we do it better? We think it is actually worthy to do the work because, in general, for us, one of the main concerns has been the international dimension to this problem, and also the non-English aspect to this problem. I think basically from our community of writers and storytellers, we feel that the false information problem has been around for a long time. Its circulation in different kinds of social media networks have definitely also been around for a long time, but we're not having as much attention to that right now in terms of the heightened sort of sense of US and EU politics, especially in the English language. So how do we continue to think about these other realms in which the same information through images now are just being spread further and continually and recycle? Thank you.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. So one for Dr. Fizz.
You don't have to call me doctor.
I know, but I take such joy out of it for Farida.
Yeah.
So the top category is false. So generally true facts, but false context in terms of the
No, true image.
true image,
Yeah.
and then false context.
Yeah,
So does that
essentially.
include, so the facts themselves, the text itself is generally true or generally false, or those kind of got lumped together?
What you tend to get is things that kind of connecting to Anne's talk, things that really push the button emotionally. So the example that I gave, which was ISIS in France, anything Islamophobia, anything kind of religious tension, so anything that is a point of tension within a particular society, that's what will be focused on. And one of the things that is also clear from research is that anything that is a kind of a metaphor that can allude to threats coming and so on works much better than kind of cold hard facts. Even if you can say, immigration levels are this, or and here's, a truthful picture, what works much better is things that really kind of play on the imagination of fears and so on. And, and we've seen that in many international examples. And so that's a huge bulk of that top category, that you have an image that is, hello Finn, that is truthful, but what that image, in terms of the context, what it plays on is essentially fears and scaremongering.
And so, on some level, this also gets into Connie's presentation, does it really matter what the specific image is, given that there's a sort of sense of truthiness that when someone is posting it, the underlying emotion is very real, even if that image wasn't. So if not that image, they would have just substituted, something else. So it's sort of almost like an emotion in search of an object to sort of validate it. And in that case, how much can the cold, hard facts actually really combat an underlying emotion? It is so weird to see like a very big version of your head out of the side.
I think that you've hit on something that I think makes this stuff so hard to deal with, because what do you then enter into? People can't have emotions, or can't, have fears or share them on these platforms. So that is a really, really difficult thing. But I think what is incredibly important to understand, and I think this panel has done very nicely with, real richness of examples, is just to get at the complexity. Like, this is what you're dealing with, right? And this spreads like wildfire. And I think that's the thing that hasn't really been understood, or it hasn't really been taken seriously. And I think if anything, hopefully our panel just contributes to, no, this stuff is here, it needs to be dealt with, how can journalists deal with it, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think one massive difficulty is that a lot of it is deeply emotive.
And I think the other aspect of it that's interesting for us too is that in terms of motivation, I think often right now in terms of the meme conversation, especially with the propaganda, there's a lot of negative emotion. But in our case, especially for these examples with the Boko Haram Nigerian sort of massacre, or for example, the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, a lot of the sharing actually are from people who want to do good. Yeah. And they're actually soul searching and trying to figure out how to respond to a crisis that's many thousands of miles away. So in that split second, when they make that choice, I don't know. I think that sort of the motivation factor is something that's also makes it so hard too, right? In terms of trying to uncover. And at least I think at this point, there's no automatic algorithm that's going to be able to do that. It's still a lot of hard analysis. Can algorithms be built to do that? Maybe there's some helps, maybe there's some approximations, but right now I think it's a lot of hand analysis, or eye analysis.
And just
I think they have to point away from each other.
Okay, yeah. Okay. So just to build on this notion of emotions as well, and truthiness, right? Is a writer I enjoy, Arlie Hochschild from Berkeley, as a sociologist, has written a lot about this notion of a deep story, that many of us live with a deep story that we grew up with, about, it's a narrative that we grew up with about society, about what's fair, what belongs to us, what do we deserve. And when you're looking at a lot of these images, when moving, in addition to the facts, thinking about its truthiness, what it speaks to. What is it saying to people, and what emotions is it tapping into? We have to understand where those emotions come from, and it needs a more sophisticated understanding of emotions that I think can be grounded in notions of cognitive behavioral science. That emotions are based on cognitions, on beliefs and stories. And so we don't have direct solutions, but if we can embrace emotions and understand where they come from, that they're not random, and they're not always destructive, but they can be productive. They can be motivated by people who want to do good. How do we embrace that? And how do we understand how they're actually built? Because there's a lot of great psychological writing about this, about where emotions come from, and I think we need to tap into that.
And in terms of, you've mentioned sort of the remix culture as a core part of this entire process, and I was curious, or I guess maybe we're all curious, on that kind of the participatoriness of creation as part of the entire process of propagation, and does it really matter? I mean, is truthfulness even a consideration when you're remixing?
I think the more important part of remix and understanding remix culture is the participation, it's the community. Is when people are remixing and sharing, they're engaging in a community. We think about this with music, with art, that you're building a community. And I think we need to start thinking about that as well. It's like, what are the communities that are reinforcing and evaluating this imagery that it motivates people to participate in remix culture? So yes, I think the facts are absolutely right, but it's really it's the community. It's the identity signals that we also need to understand. And that's, I think, remix culture, what motivates someone to just want to create something and share it for no apparent financial gain is social gain. So where is that coming from and why?
And so, microphone issues. So given that, as journalists, when they see a meme or something propagate, it seems like the meme itself is just sort of the surface manifestation of something much deeper. I mean, they tend to cover the meme itself, whether or not it's, Covfefe or like, Make America Great Again, or any number of images that went viral during the UK and French elections. So what is it that journalists can take away from what the phenomenon they're observing can show?
And I think this, I'd love to hear Farida's thoughts here in terms of the context, right? I think all of us are talking about context, that this notion of the memes are just an expression of that deeper context. And so how can you use those? I think there's one powerful way to think about this is how can you use these memes as signals for a deeper story, for an engagement beyond the media themselves. The media manipulation group at Data and Society has written a lot about this, that the charisma of memes, their attractiveness can be one way to spread misinformation because as I showed, journalists can inadvertently amplify a story that they didn't intend to. But you can't ignore them as well. So how do you go deeper? How do you research that? How do you research the communities and tell that broader context as part of this story? I feel like you guys.
Just to kind of build on that, I think they're potentially an enormously rich resource for new stories and understanding new audiences. And I think we spoke about this a little bit at the last panel last year, is if there is a sense that certain audiences aren't being heard, why is that? Why are their voices not heard within, our publications? It's not necessarily because those people have nothing to say. It's just accessing them and finding them may be slightly harder or might not be the obvious way that people write stories. And I think when it comes to this kind of stuff, this is one of the things that I think has real potential. There are stories out there. You just need to kind of find them and I think collaborate. So this is one of the things that I think all of our talks really highlighted. You can't do this alone, right? So what is the expertise that you need and how can you build long-standing partnerships with people so that this kind of work can happen? And also, what kind of resources, I guess, are needed so that, when the next election cycle comes around or whatever story breaks, that there is some sort of resource that you can dip into to just potentially just kind of figure out, okay, this hasn't been seen anywhere else, potentially it's new, what does that mean? And the other thing, I guess, I would add to that, and this is something that happens a lot in academic research, is that we tend to focus on the loudest voices, right? So a lot of this is driven by volume. So when it comes to spread, we tend to only be interested in something that has, goes over a certain threshold. It goes viral when, and so on and so forth. But that's always volume-based, right? But if you think of what is in that kind of long tail of the distribution, it might not be the exact same image, but it might be very similar kinds of images that tell collectively still a really, really important story, right? And that might be very coherent, actually, if you just look at it through a different lens. And I think, and I'm just sort of telling myself, I'm reminding myself of that as an academic, I do the exact same thing. These are the most shared, or these are the most prominent, but actually it's that. But it's also all of that vernacular stuff that is happening in the much longer tail that actually, if you look at smaller incidences and then put them together, they might actually outweigh the most viral image. And I think it's trying to figure out how you can do both. And also in terms of methods, the stuff in the long tail requires completely different methods. That's much more qualitative. That's your ethnographies, that's your interviews and so on. And I think if you can combine those, then you, I think, are starting to get at, what is kind of happening here. So for me, it's also kind of advocating, let's not do this kind of standard thing, ooh, it went viral, ooh, very exciting, a million shares. That's only a small part of the story, and there's much more happening in that long tail.
One of the things I'm taking away also from our discussions is, to kind of think about this. Thank you. It's just this conversation, I think we're talking also about democracy and the quality of it, right? So one of the, on the same side, right, like one of the exciting things about meme culture and its creativeness is the democratic aspect. To extent, like one of the things that we're wrestling with also is user-generated content, and then how do we think about the reporting of events, the rights of sort of citizens to be able to self-report, and then the distance between sort of that sort of citizen journalism to professional journalism, which has different kinds of trainings and ethics, maybe explicitly espoused ethics and so on. So I'm wondering also sort of, because I think that theme is there, elections, and we're talking about Trump, and also just sort of the ways that people are kind of thinking about the politics of image. When it comes to memes, when it comes to misinformation, some of these memes, as we are all trying to figure out how to classify too, like to what extent is like, that is perhaps a very distasteful opinion, but it is an opinion in the democratic space. That kind of sort of trying to figure out how to classify something like that in a society that has a lot of avenues to have media discussion is one thing, versus, for example, another kind of context, Myanmar, or Nepal, which there aren't as many, sort of like the rate of literacy is different. So images have a completely different power in countries and politics where there are less rates of literacy. These kinds of things, trying to think about them at a local, cultural, regional level, like I think we just have a lot of challenges before us.
I want to add one other thought here about why we're motivated to talk about the most shared content. It's also we need to think about the attention economy, right? That the way that our platforms are designed to generate attention, and that journalists and our publishing platforms are also motivated by getting attention, getting those clicks and those ads. And so given that platforms and the world in general is designed for attention, how can journalists optimize their stories for attention so that they're not driven just by the stuff that is floating around getting the most attention already, but to find new ways, to what is the new way of developing the headline? What is the new way of grabbing people's eyeballs? And we're working with a group, the Verificado 2018 group in Mexico, that has this great slogan from AJ+. It's in Spanish, viralicemos la info confiable. It's make viral the reliable information. And I just love this phrase because it's embracing that, embracing the fact that that attention operates differently now, narrative operates differently now. And so how do you do that as journalists, while responsibly reporting on things, but recognizing that to bring attention, you can't just be driven by the fact that there are images out there that are already grabbing a lot of eyeballs. You have to start to work with that as well.
Does anyone in the audience have questions? Because I can keep on going, but I don't know. Are you guys all good? Then one thing that I'm actually curious about is, at least within, Western culture, as we kind of deal with this, like, misinformation problem, it's often, at least in terms of what we're starting with in terms of combating, tends to be text-based and URL-based. So that way you can identify, either a domain or an article as inherently kind of sketchy or completely made up. Now the problem with the images is they don't necessarily live at a fixed URL where they're copied over or they're uploaded. So one is there's just a problem with kind of getting canonical identifications for some of these, and then two, the fact that they metastasize very quickly. So even if they're not exactly the same, they tend to evolve. And so clearly with your case study, you see it like metastasize in a very strange way across the entire world. So in terms of the Avenger style group that is collected to try to combat the misinformation and disinformation, are there any strategies that are realistic?
So I think basically one of the places that we have to start, at least, is just the recognition that already there is a lot of sophisticated, on the one hand, this is very hard. On the other hand, the sort of analyses or algorithms that are currently being built, say for example by Google in terms of image analysis, is growing every single day, right? So the number of machine algorithms that are being fed constant levels of image. Some of you may have seen certain coverage. Yeah, some of you may have seen, for example, some stories related to bias in algorithms having to do with race, for example. Or one example that I saw recently had to do with, you can actually, in Google Video, for example, and these data sets are also available. They're trying to be more transparent. You can actually download them themselves. They're also trying to train the automatic visual detection of moving images, right? So one example I saw yesterday was how Google's trying to train algorithms to see a person carrying a baby. When the person actually started looking at some of the examples of the code, all of the examples about the carrying baby were by women. They're women carrying babies. There are no men carrying babies, but there are actually increasing numbers of men who also carry babies. So I think one of the questions that we have is like, as we try to think about using the tools, let's say like, as a journalist, all of this stuff like that automatically comes to us via these algorithms. On the one hand, it is amazing, right? That you can actually, the technology it takes to recognize a cat, like that is an amazing amount of technology that now we kind of take for granted. So I guess I would say that we have to start somewhere. We have to start at least trying to classify and identify images in a more sophisticated way that we can perhaps feed back into some of these algorithms, and that potentially we can have some tools in the future. That's sort of, I think, where we are right now.
Hi, I'm with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and obviously we track this kind of information very closely. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the broader psychological effect of this kind of disinformation and misinformation. Certainly part of what I'm wrestling with is the psychological response that we're seeing as profoundly authoritarian, especially from misinformation. And Dr. Meany, you mentioned the importance of supporting democracy through proper information. And I wondered if you would mind talking about that.
So I think there's kind of two thoughts I have for that right now. One is that here's a question back to you. Do you think that we're all a little depressed right now? And I asked this because I was talking to someone at The Guardian yesterday, and they entered with the year with a profound sense of despair, right? And so thinking about how to cover the news, they have now a new series called The Upside. I don't know if anyone has seen this. But it's an explicit effort to sort of sit there and say, we do a lot of coverage on things seem really dark right now, but aren't there points of light? Aren't there examples that we can kind of go to and think about solutions, think about ways that, yes, things are hard, but certainly there must be a way forward. And actually, interestingly enough, with the tools that we are able to leverage through our partnerships with MIT and Harvard, as well as Georgia Tech, I will say, though, that when we look at, for example, English language news, because those are the best algorithms that we have available, when it comes to talking about teens or women or a number of different subjects, the general thread of news is to cover it in negative terms. So, for example, in a recent story that we did on how teens are, and this is not just in the US or Canada or the UK, this is English language news worldwide. When you talk about teens, the most common terms are murder, drugs, etc., right? Is there something about our reporting that we're gravitating towards very negative events? Perhaps that's part of the journalistic ethic to try and speak truth to power, right? That makes sense. But is there an aspect to the speaking truth to power that also may now, in this new kind of information flood, ask journalists, should we also be thinking about the solutions that are available as well? So those are a couple of different thoughts that I have right now. I swing myself in terms of the spectrum, but I think you definitely have people who feel the same way and are trying to figure out how to have more optimism and hope.
And just to add there, I think we're seeing this rise in memes and emotions around authoritarianism and hate. I think we need to recognize that. It's in the same context. We've seen the hashtag #MeToo movement. We've seen the hashtag March for Our Lives. We've seen Black Lives Matter. We've seen a lot of other kind of mimetic strategies here. And I think when we're looking, the reason I think it's really important to understand how disinformation operates is we need to understand why it's influential. I think what we're looking at is modes of influence in the 21st century, and that if we do not take that seriously, I'm not being facetious to say we need to take Kim Kardashian, Grumpy Cat, we need to take all these dynamics seriously because these are all modes of influence. And the fact that we didn't take them seriously earlier has allowed for authoritarians and hate groups to use these methods to spread a message. But what we're really looking at is media influence here. And I think if we understand how media is influenced today, there might be other ways to get to what Connie was talking about building positive messages and other kinds of stories.
Can I just add something? I think one of the things that's really difficult is that news is driven by events, and positive stories tend to be much more about processes, communities, and so on, where there isn't an immediate event hook to report on. So I did my PhD on the Palestine-Israel conflict. So terrorism sells lots of newspapers. When the peace process was on its way, nothing was reported. Once you have the photograph, the iconic photograph of the handshake, it's kind of like, that's it. Let's wait for this kind of, peace process to go belly up, which of course it did. And then, the stories start flooding in again. And in some way, that is kind of counterproductive to maybe what you want to hear about. Maybe you want to hear, actually, Israel-Palestine, things are good. There haven't been any kind of significant events. But that's not how news works. That's not what sells stories. So I think what we're also getting at is just the absolute foundation of how news is made. And it's made driven by events, and often, especially with kind of hard news, it's negative, and so we're up in that sense. We're up against a lot, and so the actors that you were talking about, they also really understand that in order to kind of get a positive story through, it has to also be events driven. But then what happens after that march? Does that news cycle then continue around this group of high school students? Not really.
We need to figure out a way to continue that story.
Yeah.
And we can actually continue this conversation. Directly afterwards, we are actually doing a small workshop for any journalists who actually want to understand the idea of how can you use these memes as a sort of to dig into deeper stories. If it's a small group, which it might be, we are just going to go to Fresco, which is around the corner, which has great coffee and great sandwiches. There's also a workshop tomorrow at 2 o'clock at Hotel Rosetta, which is not in the event schedule, but you can email us from from the listing online. And then last but not least, there's also a dinner. We're having a Mimi dinner tonight at Restaurant Del Sol. Restaurante del Sol, which has like a great view. And if you want to sort of like meme together with us, a group of us are getting together at 8 p.m. So thank you very much to our excellent panelists who come very well prepared with beautiful slides and intelligent arguments. And if you're interested in, workshopping with us, feel free. Actually, approach us right now, and then we'll try to get a good critical mass.